How does a guy like you win in California? I mean, I'm looking at the numbers from the primary. She got, obviously it wasn't a head-to-head, but she got 74% of the vote. You got 13%. Now it is, I mean, I think there's a Republican running in the general too, but I mean, there's not. Okay.
Just to be clear, I knocked all the Republicans out. Our primary system allows only the top two, and I am the first Democrat in 30 years. So that's how we win, first of all, is just by being another Democrat on the ballot. She's never had another Democrat against her ever in 30 years.
Well, what I mean by how do you win is, you know, when I look at somebody like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, she won in New York. You know, the districts she represents are not San Francisco. You know, San Francisco, you know better than I, but my understanding is, you know, it's kind of the old guard, Democratic establishment, a lot of young people, but do they come out? So how does somebody like you, you know, a month or so till election, also given, you know, these negative headlines you've had to deal with, how do you gather enough new voters? Because I think in this case, it would be that Bernie strategy of galvanizing as much people who don't vote or have become cynical and stop voting for a couple cycles. How do you win? Because it's going to take a huge amount of voter turnout, a lot of new voters, and, you know, Pelosi, she's going to have those traditional, particularly older voters, you know, people with money, six-figure types, to come out for her.
And every labor union in the city, just to be clear, like the establishment progressives in San Francisco don't support their own stated principles. They support the incumbent because she's powerful. So the headwinds I'm running into include a local media landscape that has been more inclined to print lies about me than anything about what I'm running on or the issues. The local progressive organized establishment abandoning this race in the face of this smear campaign that ultimately promoted the incumbent and the establishment. We've been outspent 15-1. Nancy Pelosi is the leading corporate fundraiser in the House, and every labor union in the city has undermined the interests of its rank and file by endorsing the incumbent who opposes working class interests. So those are very profound headwinds. On the other side of it, billboards for our campaign have literally been written in the sky. On September 9th, the sky was blood red at high noon. And I can't conceive of or even fathom a more compelling and widely visible indication that something is amiss and wrong. And I think the real question in our race, it's a test of our democracy, and it's a test, frankly, of San Francisco. Is San Francisco care enough about our own principles and the future to show up for them now that we have the first chance in a generation to do it? Or are we so ultimately brainwashed by corporate media sources that we falsely think we're being represented by a line of the left who, in fact, paves the road to fascism? And, you know, all I can do is articulate the platform and reach as many voters as we can. I will say that people with an interest in the future who share our principles, anyone, anywhere, can make a difference. We are actively phone banking and text banking. Anybody's welcome to join us at shahid.fyi/volunteer. If anybody dialed for Bernie, the system will look very familiar. The people that I hired after we won the primary were a bunch of Bernie campaign veterans. And so that's why the campaign accelerated so much before the smear campaigns hit. And it's why we're still poised to win this race in spite of all the headwinds that you described. I'd put it this way. The way we win the race is simply by the failure of the establishment becoming so inescapably obvious. And it is now so inescapably obvious. 250,000 Americans, practically, we're close to that, have died from a disease that was, frankly, it didn't have to be this bad. No other country in the world has suffered the way we have. And one big reason for that, the most obvious reason for that, is that we don't let people get care or medicine when they need it. We condition access to care on cost, on the market. And that was always an abuse of human rights. And now it's just senselessly stupid and idiotic. And we see it demonstrated in the statistics every day with every person dying alone, gasping for breath. We are seeing the failure of an establishment with every family that's getting evicted because they can't go to work while the government and the economy shut down. That is a failure of leadership and policy. With every person who has to flee their home because the entire state, the entire West Coast has been on fire. That's a failure of policy. And these failures of policy demand accountability. I'm grateful for the chance to be the first Democrat to face Nancy Pelosi in a generation. And if San Franciscans care enough about change and want it, I'm looking forward to representing our city in Washington in the next congressional session.
And I just want to read a question from a viewer, Super Chat, Michael Williams. Shahid, explain why anyone should bother voting when both parties are essentially the same when it comes to fiscal, foreign, and military policy. I'll add on to that. Obviously this isn't about your race, but when you look at Biden versus Trump, I understand the dangers of Trump, but I also think it's my job to tell viewers the truth. Even if Biden wins, he's basically told Wall Street donors, you're good, right? Biden has not called for anything to meet the moment during the pandemic, not a universal basic income, not expanding Medicare, basically, some vagueness about restoring the soul of something. So he's not, even if we get rid of Trump, the wine moms and the upper class will, be able to go back to brunch. But those who have lost their jobs, those who have no health care right now, those in San Francisco that are victims of gentrification, they're pretty much in the same place. Obviously, if you're black, brown, you face a graver threat from Trump. We understand that. But what do you say to those discouraged people, both on the federal level from voting, but also people in San Francisco? Maybe they're watching this for the first time. They weren't going to vote. Why should people vote if basically both parties, there's so much overlap?
It's very difficult for me to defend the Biden campaign. I don't have a great deal in common with his platform. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, very early on after the field coalesced around Biden, made the point that in no other country would we be in the same party, because frankly, he's much closer to Trump than he is to us. And I share the skepticism of the opportunity for change. In fact, if I am so fortunate to represent San Francisco and Washington, I will be fighting the next administration from the left, whoever it is. I don't know which character of conservatism it will be, if it's Trump's fascism outright, or if it's merely Biden's deference to corporate rule and the military-industrial complex. Neither of those are acceptable to me. And I'm running, the precise reason I am running for Congress is to challenge either of those outcomes. I am an immigrant who cares about the United States and wants to preserve our values in a time of crisis, and wants to retain some modicum of democracy, wants to meet the needs of our communities. And that's why I'm running. I think the disillusion with the parties and the recognition that they do so much to support each other is precisely why I'm trying to knock the leader of the corporate Democratic Party out of her chair. Because as long as she is in Congress, nothing will happen in Congress either, right? The point about Biden is true with respect to the executive branch. The same thing is true of Nancy Pelosi. As long as she remains in Congress, the Green New Deal will remain a dream. As long as Nancy Pelosi remains in Congress, anytime there's a proposed surveillance authority, it will pass. As long as Nancy Pelosi remains in the House, there won't be any meaningful resistance to this criminal administration or whatever conservative follows him. We need members of Congress who understand the oath of office enough to stand up for it when it matters, who recognize what it means to fight domestic enemies of our Constitution, like our criminal president. We need members of Congress who are close enough to the lived experience of Americans to understand when we're in crisis. My family lost our home when I was 16 years old. It took me 10 years to get my undergrad degree because I worked and went to night school. I understand what it's like to struggle, and I know what people are going through now. And, Nancy Pelosi is as someone who is, let's just say, very removed from any of the crises to which the rest of us are subjected, either has been unable or remains unwilling to do the job of representing the people of San Francisco and defending the interests of the people of the United States.
And last question, to me, I look at what's going on in California, Portland, with these wildfires. Of course, the corporate media, you're lucky if they even talk about climate change. But the dirty little secret, of course, it's the fossil fuel companies. But really what's creating these wildfires is the big banks that Nancy Pelosi is a servant of. These fossil fuel projects are not happening without major banks funding them. We saw that there has been divestment campaigns against some of the big banks that have been successful. But, if you were on a debate stage with Nancy Pelosi, or because frankly, you're going to have to get some of those traditional normie Democrats who mindlessly just go every time and vote for Pelosi, what would be your message for them to rethink? I don't think Bernie necessarily spoke to these older, more traditional Democratic voters the way in terms of think about your grandchildren, think about your children. What would be your message to them to actually take a minute and not automatically vote for Pelosi? Why is she complicit in these wildfires, the climate catastrophe, and why should they, give somebody new a shot?
The policy paradigm of Congress over the last generation is one of deference and active support for the fossil fuel industries, not just in our energy policy, but even our foreign policy, right? Every country we invade for oil is serving that industry. It's like we have an intersectional set of policies designed to serve and subsidize fossil fuel extraction. And it's senseless. There's no reason, frankly, that we should even allow people to the monetary incentive to engage in resource plunder inherently robs the future. That's embedded in the business model. And we don't have markets, for instance, in people's votes. We don't have at least legal markets for people's body parts, and that's because the legal regime conditions the market, right? We could just as easily say fossil fuel extraction is a thing that, if it's going to happen, it is not going to happen to make somebody wealthy, but instead because it needs to happen. Like it's a perfect case for nationalization of an industry. Just like weapons manufacturing, that's another industry that shouldn't have its own parochial interest driving policy. But we see that happen time and time again. Nancy Pelosi has overseen a historic rise in fracking across the country. She's not been an active agent of seeking climate justice, and in fact has actively stood on the other side. She derides the Green New Deal as the Green New Dream or whatever. And while she has talked a big game about environmentalism, it's really just like every other issue where she claims to stand for progressive interests. It's all talk without policy. This is exactly why she should debate, and why I think that voters in San Francisco who might be coming to the race or considering their options for the first time might also share their interest in a debate. Debates have a crucial role in our democracy. And again, the refusal of an incumbent for 30 years to defend their ideas in public might suggest that their ideas are indefensible. And in fact, that's true here. I think everybody on Pelosi's team knows that if she shows up for a debate against me, it's the end of her career. And it's precisely because her record is indefensible.
Well, I should also add, sorry to interrupt, she's gotten testy when even the most little, the very scarce pushback from journalists. I mean, Jake Tapper kind of asked her, maybe your strategy isn't so good a couple interviews ago, and she got extremely testy to the point of, how dare you question me?
Not only testy and entitled, but she said that there's no point in considering what might have been. And that is the attitude of somebody who doesn't show up for debates for 30 years and treats their office like an entitlement. There's absolutely a point in debating what might have been, because her record is so demonstrably unacceptable. And I don't want to hammer this too hard. The question is it the case that Nancy Pelosi has been actively complicit in advancing conservative goals, or has she simply been unable to stop the steamrolling conservative train? The evidence suggests that she's much more active than we would wish, and that's why we have to remove her from Congress, because as long as Nancy Pelosi is in Congress, the Republican Party will have an easy path to achieve all of its objectives. She, frankly, is the crux of conservative rule. And I can make that case different ways. We haven't talked about this, but just a thing to throw on the table. We talked about a lot of recent issues. The very first thing she did as the speaker in this congressional session was impose the PAYGO rules, conservative Republican accounting rules. This was not an act of weak, ineffectual resistance. This was an act of complicity with conservative goals. And there's absolutely no good reason why a voice actively promoting conservative goals should represent a city that is among the proudest progressive capitals of this country. And I'm eager to offer us a new voice in Washington.
And to end, I just want to read one more viewer super chat. Nancy says, I live in Russian Hill neighborhood in a small rent-controlled apartment in San Francisco. Strongly support Shahid. My, quote, liberal neighbors love Pelosi. So I'm sure there's a lot of that where, you have those older, and it's not, I don't want to be blanket that it's all old people, because there's older progressives too, but that kind of entrenched, they've been fed that Nancy Pelosi is kind of like a yes queen fighter against Trump and Bush, and they might not know underneath all that marketing and branding of her, she's been very complicit in furthering the conservative project.
Yeah, you nailed it. I think it's less generational and much more about how much attention somebody pays. If people who pay attention to politics in San Francisco break for us because they recognize what the incumbent is doing, and people who watch MSNBC or corporate news and don't actually investigate the facts or read independent news sources, they fall for the spin and the corporate propaganda. They think that Nancy Pelosi is Trump's greatest antagonist when she is in fact his greatest enabler in Washington, and that's exactly why we have to replace her. I see ultimately our election as a referendum on how sophisticated San Francisco is, and is it hoodwinked by the Beltway and corporate media, or are we still the proud progressive mecca of the West Coast? And the last piece I just say here is I see in that attitude of the older folks you were describing. If I am guilty of the political crime of saying different things in different crowds, it is basically what I emphasize, and I emphasize climate justice to younger folks and to older folks, because you were mentioning the people who've been here and voted for many times. For those people, what I emphasize, and it's not inconsistent, I have this, these are both parts of my platform, but I emphasize universal health care. You were saying, think about your kids and your grandkids. I say that to younger people. To older people who I wish, to older people, I often say, just think about yourselves. 40% of cancer patients exhaust their life savings within the first year of diagnosis and treatment.
Right.
And any physician will talk who deals in palliative or end-of-life care about the spend down to Medicaid. That's our policy, is to use sickness as an extraction opportunity and then kick sick people into the street. And I don't think any American wants that. We are better than that as a civilization. We can do better than that. All we have to do is change some people in Congress who are willing to stand with our communities before corporations. And I'm excited to be a part of that wave in the next session of
And
Congress.
one more time, where can people find out more if they want to volunteer or help you in some way?
Check us out online. We're at shahidforchange.us or on any of the major social media platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at Shahid for Change.
Cool. Thank you, Shahid. We'll be in touch.
Right on. Thanks for having me on, Jordan. It's always great to be with you.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com, where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.
Status Coup.